Hello, everyone. Today we're going to be going over the Gestalt Principles, also known as the laws of perception, and also known as Gestalt laws. So let's get right into it. So, for background, before we start talking about these principles, let's talk about the actual word of Gestalt. So, Gestalt in German means the way a thing has been placed or put together. A lot of what we'll be talking about today has to go over how things are assembled or put together. And before we get to the principles, we're going to start off by talking about Gestalt psychology. So this originated in Austria and Germany during the late 1920s. The founders were Max Wertheimer, Wolfgang Köhler, and Kurt Kafka. And this is important from a visual perspective because it's the modern study of perception. It is how we view items in front of us and how our brain interprets it. And this is important because it has had a strong influence on modern art and design since being introduced. And then for Gestalt theory, it is in summary talking about how the whole is anything greater than its parts. And what exactly does this mean? This is at times related to what Aristotle has been quoted as saying the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. But from what this talks about from Gestalt theory, the mind informs what the eye sees by perceiving a series of individual elements as a whole. And what Kurt Kafka says is that the whole is other than the sum of the parts. That is different from what Aristotle is saying, because as Kurt Kafka is saying, is that it's a different entity all in itself. It is the whole that is made up of its parts should be seen as something different and not just a greater entity. And that would be where him and Aristotle differ on this perspective. So now as we go into the principles themselves describe how humans visually group similar elements, how humans recognize patterns, and how they simplify complex images when we perceive objects. And the overall value of understanding the Gestalt principles is that it will influence the hierarchy of what you want your audience to view. It will influence how you want them to read and basically gather information that you're presenting to them. So for a product standpoint, this might help them understand your product's function, its usability within where they need to navigate to click on certain items within certain screens and perform certain operations. And then last is that it will help your user read and your product be more readable by going about these practices. So a lot of different articles will break down around 6 to 8, even 9 different principles. But for today's lesson, we have 8, and these are going to be the most common that you come across. So let's get right into it. So for law number 1, the law of similarity, what the law of similarity states is that the human brain tends to group objects that appear similar. So what does this mean? So if we look at this graphic in front of us, we have a visual of circles and triangles. And if I was to say, please group these into 3 groups, you might place in the top row of circles, the second row of triangles, and that bottom row of circles as well. So what this states is that we as humans will differentiate and group similar items And for this example, we have them as shapes. So the circles, we could see them as a group, and the triangles as a separate group. Another way that we can use this law of similarity is grouping elements by color. So in this example, we could group and separate these two different groups by having the white circles and the orange circles as its own group. And that's how we're using color to contrast the different elements in the different groups. And then we can also use the design element of scale, where we can have the circles being regular circles being one size, and then smaller circles being that of a smaller scale. And this helps the human eye read this and basically understand that there could be 2 to 3 different groups being created, but basically the smaller circles are one group, and you could also visualize this as the 2 by 5 group on the left is one entity, and the one on the right is a separate. So scale is the third way that we can differentiate items for similarity. For the law of symmetry, the law of symmetry states that the human brain, when confronted with complex shapes, tends to reorganize the shapes into simpler components. So let's take a look at this example. So an extremely famous logo. This is the Olympic ring logo. And this is very much talked about and researched in several graphic design books and heavily studied. The thing is that our mind automatically wants to see these as 5 interlinking rings. We want to make this very simple. However, why are we skimming over the complexities of these interlinking areas from the rings? So for example, you see the negative space where these rings are overlapping. Well, how come I'm not seeing these more intricate pieces as separate entities? Why do I still, as the human eye, see these as 5 rings? And the answer is, for this law of symmetry, is that our eye wants to make these shortcuts. It wants to go to something that's very familiar to us, and that is why we simplify these shapes into something that is very easy for us to digest. The next law is the law of proximity. And what it states is that the human brain perceives objects close to one another as belonging to the same group. So for this example, we have 3 groups organized, and we're using the design element of space to create proximity for these 3 groups. So for our left example, for the 5 by 5, we are using a smaller amount of space to cluster these circles together so that we perceive them as one group. We are then using larger amounts of space in between our left and our middle group to create separation, and that way we have closer proximity within our groups. So in our middle group, we have the 2 by 5 row and columns of the group of circles, and these are in the same, acquire the same amount of space as we do on the left-hand one. And then for our last group on the right, the 1 by 5, we again are separating this by the design element of space to separate it from the other 2 groups. And this is the law of proximity, using space to create groups for the human eye to group together. For law number 4, the law of continuity, it basically states that the human eye prefers following the smoothest path of lines and curves. So the human eye, if it sees a series of similar shapes, it's going to start to follow that path. It automatically starts to create this journey for itself and goes along that path. That path can be disrupted if it has intersecting lines, but it's generally always going to take the smoothest path. And that is what the law of continuity states. For the next law, we have the law of closure. And what it states is the human brain tends to complete the missing part of a visual if the visual is incomplete. So in this example, we see 3 Pac-Man and they are facing each other. However, I think we also see the triangle on top, the black triangle on top of the white circles. And what our mind starts to do is automatically starts to make the outline around the triangle. And so the Gestalt principle will say our mind is automatically going to complete that shape that we're familiar with and complete this idea. So it's easy for us to understand. For law number 6, figure ground, what this states is that humans instinctively see objects as figure and ground. Go figure. For the first part, for figure, representing that an object of focus is in the foreground. Basically, it is the figure is what is closest to you and what you perceive as the first thing you would interact with. And then you have ground, represents the background of an image. So this would be your backdrop. This is what you have in the background. If you're taking a photograph, this would be your bokeh, and that's how we differentiate between these two. And the visual to communicate this is this vase graphic. And this is a very famous psychological vase to where at first glance, if you're your first time seeing this, is that you might see a black vase that you're either going to put flowers in or you can put some type of ornamentation in. But secondarily, what you might see are 2 men that are facing each other. And you see their noses, you see their lips, and you see their chins. So this is a graphic that communicates how someone can manipulate a visual to making the user understand and decipher what is foreground and background. Law number 7 is law of common region, and what it states is the human eye perceives items within a boundary as a group and assumes to share some common characteristic or functionality. So when we talk about this, we have our same 5x5 group of circles, and if I put a container around the bottom row of circles, those are seen as a common group. And so this is where I can have some flexibility to further adjust this so that way this group can be seen as its own entity apart from the other circles. And then we have the law of common fate. And what the law of common fate states is that humans will group together things that point to or are moving in the same direction. So for this example, and what's a common reference is a flock of birds flying together. Even though there are individual birds, as you see the leader of the pack and of the cluster flying in one direction and it alters, you'll see the others follow suit, and it looks as if there's this organic bubble that is flying through the air. But this idea within visuals is basically saying if something has motion or has perceived motion attached to it, the user is going to go with that flow and look at that entity as one object. And as we wrap up, I just want to say thank you for your time and your patience of just going through this lesson. Here are some additional references and some articles that you might find interesting that were referenced in this lesson. Sources ranging from Britannica, UC Berkeley to Webflow, and your Gestalt principles are really going to help you sculpt an experience that your users can ultimately get value from and helping them proceed easier throughout their day. And so without further ado, I'll talk to you guys later. Michael Gurney here, and I'll talk to you guys soon. All right. Bye bye.